December 19th, 1941. Kure Naval Arsenal, Hiroshima Prefecture, Japan. The winter sun hangs low over the Seto Inland Sea, casting long shadows across the dockyards, where the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy rests in concrete slips and steel cradles. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi stands on the observation platform overlooking the arsenal, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. Below him, the battleship Yamato, the largest, most powerful warship ever constructed, undergoes final preparations before joining the combined fleet. 72,000 tons of steel and ambition, armed with 18-inch guns that can hurl shells weighing more than a small automobile. The ship represents everything the Imperial Navy believes about naval warfare: quality over quantity, technological superiority, the decisive battle doctrine that has guided Japanese naval thinking since Admiral Togo's victory over Russia in 1905. Onishi holds a file of intelligence reports, papers that smell of ink and urgency. The reports detail American shipbuilding capacity, industrial production figures, merchant marine tonnage. The numbers are almost incomprehensible. American steel production exceeds Japan's by a factor of 12 to 1. American oil production is 200 times greater. The industrial disparity is so vast that it seems less like military intelligence and more like comparing different species of civilization. But these are mere statistics, abstract figures that can be dismissed or contextualized. What troubles Onishi more than the raw numbers is a single detail buried in the intelligence summary. The Americans are developing a standardized merchant ship design that can be mass-produced using assembly line techniques borrowed from automobile manufacturing. The projected construction time is 60 days per vessel. Onishi looks again at the Yamato. The battleship has been under construction for nearly 4 years. 4 years of skilled labor, precision engineering, resources carefully marshaled by a nation that must import 80% of its oil, 90% of its iron ore, every pound of rubber and aluminum consumed by its war machine. The ship is a masterpiece. It is also irreplaceable. If the Yamato sinks, Japan cannot build another, not while fighting a war. Not with resources stretched across an empire that extends from Burma to the Central Pacific. The Vice Admiral folds the intelligence reports and tucks them inside his coat. Around him, the sounds of the naval arsenal continue their industrial symphony. The clang of hammers on steel, the hiss of welding torches, the shouts of foremen directing work crews. These sounds represent Japan's maximum industrial effort, the peak capacity of a nation that has been preparing for war since the invasion of Manchuria a decade ago. It is impressive. It is disciplined. It is wholly insufficient for the kind of war that the intelligence reports suggest is coming. A war of industrial attrition where victory belongs not to the side with the best ships, but to the side that can replace its losses faster than the enemy can inflict them. But such thoughts are defeatist. Japan has struck Pearl Harbor 13 days ago. The Pacific Fleet lies crippled in Hawaiian waters. American battleships rest on the bottom of the harbor, or listing against their moorings, their guns silent, their crews mourning. The Philippines are falling. Malaya will fall. The entire Western Pacific is becoming a Japanese lake, protected by carriers and submarines and the warrior spirit that has animated Japanese military culture for centuries. The Americans will build ships, certainly, but they will also lose them to Japanese submarines, to carrier strikes, to the endless attrition of an oceanic war fought across distances that strain even the most robust logistics. And when American ships sink, American morale will crack. The soft, democratic peoples of the United States, with their love of comfort and their aversion to sacrifice, will negotiate peace rather than endure years of losses for distant imperial possessions that mean nothing to farmers in Iowa or shopkeepers in Ohio. This is the assumption that guides Japanese strategic planning. This is the calculus that justified the attack on Pearl Harbor, The gamble that a sharp shock would convince America to accept Japanese dominance in Asia rather than fight a long war of attrition. It is a reasonable assumption, built on careful observation of American politics and culture. It is supported by historical precedent. Americans abandoned the Philippines after the Spanish-American War, granted independence to Cuba, showed no appetite for permanent empire. What the assumption fails to account for, what no amount of intelligence gathering could fully reveal, is the peculiar American relationship with industrial production, the way that mass manufacturing has become embedded in national identity, the cultural commitment to solving problems through overwhelming material application. Japan sees American democracy as a weakness, a system that privileges comfort over sacrifice. But American democracy has married itself to industrial capitalism in ways that create capabilities that authoritarian efficiency cannot match. The assembly line, the standardized part, the interchangeable component, these are not merely manufacturing techniques, but expressions of a democratic philosophy that treats workers as valuable, that assumes human potential can be maximized through system design rather than martial discipline. Vice Admiral Onishi cannot see this cultural dimension in his intelligence reports. He sees only numbers, steel production, oil reserves, shipyard capacity, and numbers can be interpreted, contextualized, explained away. What he cannot yet imagine is the sound that will define the Pacific War's outcome. The sound of a ship being launched every single day, from shipyards that did not exist when the war began, built by workers who had never touched a welding torch before Pearl Harbor, creating a steel tide that will drown Japanese submarines in targets, overwhelm Japanese air defenses with sheer volume, and make a mockery of every tactical victory that Japanese forces achieve through skill and courage and sacrifice. That sound, the crash of a hull hitting water, the roar of a crowd christening another Liberty ship, another Victory ship, another fleet of grey steel freighters carrying the wealth of a continent toward distant battlefields. That sound is coming. It will arrive with the inevitability of an industrial process that, once begun, cannot be stopped or negotiated with or defeated through tactical brilliance. It will drown out the prayers at Shinto shrines, the battle cries of banzai charges, the desperate courage of men fighting in the shadow of ships that appear faster than they can be sunk. But on this December morning in 1941, with winter sunlight reflecting off the Yamato's massive superstructure, with victory fresh and total in the Pacific, Vice Admiral Onishi can only see what his culture and training have prepared him to see, a long war of attrition that Japan can win through superior spirit and tactical excellence, through submarines and carrier strikes, through making the Americans bleed until their soft democratic politics forces a negotiated peace. He does not hear the sound yet. None of them do. The sound of American shipyards awakening like slumbering giants, of assembly lines organizing chaos into production, of a nation transforming itself into an engine of material supremacy that will bury Japanese tactical excellence under an avalanche of steel and diesel and welded hull plates. The sound is coming, but on December 19th, 1941, it is still silent, a potential not yet realized, a capability not yet mobilized, a future that exists only in the blueprints of an eccentric ship designer and the calculations of production planners who understand that winning wars requires not just courage, but capacity, not just warriors but welders, not just sacrifice but ships, endless ships, ships beyond counting. The ship that would change the mathematics of Pacific naval warfare was conceived not by military planners, but by a civilian engineer with a reputation for unorthodox thinking. Henry J. Kaiser had made his fortune building dams, Boulder Dam, Grand Coulee, engineering projects of unprecedented scale that required managing thousands of workers and millions of tons of concrete on strict deadlines. He understood industrial processes with the intimacy of a man who had climbed from gravel pit laborer to construction magnate through sheer competence and relentless focus on efficiency. When the British Purchasing Commission approached American shipbuilders in 1940, seeking merchant vessels to replace losses from German U-boat attacks, Kaiser saw an opportunity to revolutionize an industry that still operated using craft traditions dating to the age of wooden ships. Traditional shipbuilding in 1940 was a skilled trade, almost an art form. Ships were built from the keel up by workers who had served multi-year apprenticeships, who understood hull stresses and compartment design through accumulated experience passed down across generations. A single Liberty ship contained approximately 30,000 separate parts, 250,000 rivets, 18 miles of welding seams. Building such a vessel conventionally required 8 months to a year, employed hundreds of skilled craftsmen, and resulted in ships that were individually unique, each one slightly different from its sisters due to modifications made during construction. Materials substituted when specifications were unavailable. The accumulated decisions of foremen and master shipwrights exercising their professional judgment. Kaiser looked at this process and saw waste of time, waste of skill, waste of the flexibility that standardization could provide. He proposed building ships the way Ford built automobiles, using prefabricated sections constructed by semi-skilled workers in factories far from the shipyards, then assembling these sections using welding rather than riveting, reducing construction time through parallel production and assembly line logic. The sections could be built in standard sizes that allowed for easy transport by rail. Workers could be trained in weeks rather than years because each would perform a limited set of standardized tasks rather than needing to master the entire craft. The resulting ships would be identical, interchangeable, their parts compatible across the entire fleet. The established shipbuilding industry regarded Kaiser with the mixture of contempt and suspicion that traditional craftsmen reserve for outsiders, proposing to revolutionize their field. He was a dam builder, they said, a concrete pourer who knew nothing about ships or the sea. His welded hulls would crack in rough weather. His prefabricated sections would fail under the stresses of ocean crossings. His assembly line workers would produce inferior vessels that would break apart or sink or prove unreliable in the service conditions that only experienced shipwrights understood. The criticism was not entirely unfair. Kaiser had never built a ship before proposing to reinvent the industry. But he understood something that the traditional shipbuilders did not, that war creates different requirements than peace, that speed of production matters more than individual excellence, that sufficient ships built quickly will always defeat superior ships built slowly. The WWII Liberty ship design that Kaiser championed was based on a British tramp steamer, an unglamorous cargo hauler with no aesthetic pretensions and no technological sophistication. It was 441 feet long, displaced 14,000 tons fully loaded, could carry 10,000 tons of cargo at 11 knots. The design used a reciprocating steam engine, a technology already obsolete in 1940 because reciprocating engines were simple, reliable, and could be manufactured by companies with no previous marine engine experience. Every element of the design prioritized manufacturability over performance, standardization over optimization. The Liberty ship would never win speed records or carry unusual cargo, but it could be built in enormous numbers by workers who 6 months earlier had been farming or teaching school or working retail. And it could carry enough cargo to keep armies supplied and allies fed across oceanic distances that made logistics as important as tactics. The first Liberty ship, the SS Patrick Henry, was launched in September 1941, 3 months before Pearl Harbor. It took 244 days to complete. The performance was unimpressive by Kaiser's standards, but revolutionary compared to conventional merchant ship construction. More importantly, it proved the concept. The prefabricated sections fit together. The welded hull held. The ship could steam across oceans carrying cargo in its 5 holds. It was ugly. Critics called Liberty ships ugly ducklings for their utilitarian appearance, but it was functional. And functionality at scale was what the coming war would demand. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and Germany declared war on the United States 4 days later, Kaiser's shipbuilding system suddenly transformed from controversial innovation to strategic necessity. America faced simultaneous wars across 2 oceans, requiring the projection of military force across distances that made logistics the central strategic challenge. Every soldier fighting in the Pacific or Europe needed food, ammunition, fuel, medicine, spare parts, winter uniforms, mail from home. Every tank required gallons of gasoline, every artillery piece needed shells, every aircraft needed aviation fuel and bombs and replacement engines. And all of this material had to cross thousands of miles of ocean, infested with German U-boats in the Atlantic and Japanese submarines in the Pacific. The mathematics were brutal. Intelligence estimates suggested that German U-boats were sinking Allied shipping at a rate of approximately 600,000 tons per month in early 1942. Japanese submarines added to the toll. If sinking rates exceeded construction rates, the Allied merchant fleet would shrink, choking off supply lines, making it impossible to sustain offensive operations, potentially forcing a negotiated peace before American industrial might could be brought to bear. The Battle of the Atlantic, as it came to be called, was fundamentally a race between German submarines and American shipyards, between the rate at which Germany could destroy merchant shipping and the rate at which America could replace it. Kaiser's response was to do what he had done with dams: industrialize the process, eliminate bottlenecks, train workers in specialized tasks rather than general crafts, build ships faster than any rational analysis suggested was possible. He established shipyards in Richmond, California, converting mudflats into industrial complexes that employed tens of thousands of workers on round-the-clock shifts. He recruited women who had never worked in heavy industry, African Americans excluded from skilled trades by Jim Crow segregation, men too old for military service, anyone with hands and willingness to learn. He broke the construction process into small, repeatable tasks that could be mastered in days. He implemented incentive systems that rewarded speed. He created on-site childcare so that mothers could work. He organized the shipyards like film studios, with cranes and assembly jigs positioned to minimize movement and maximize efficiency. The production times began to fall with mathematical precision. A Liberty ship that took 244 days in 1941 required 150 days by early 1942, then 90 days, then 60 days, then 42 days on average, with some ships completed in less than 30. The Richmond shipyards launched a ship every 24 hours at peak production. The sound of hulls crashing into water became a daily occurrence. Each launch celebrated with a brief ceremony, a speech by management, a champagne bottle shattered against the bow, a roar from the workers whose sweat and welding torches had created another vessel in the growing fleet. The Liberty ship became a symbol of American industrial capacity in ways that no weapon system could match. It was not glamorous. It was not technologically sophisticated. But it was relentless, an expression of manufacturing capability that created facts faster than enemy action could negate them. For every Liberty ship that a German U-boat torpedoed, 3 more slid down launching ways. For every vessel that Japanese submarines sent to the bottom, 4 more were completed. The arithmetic of attrition tilted inexorably in favor of the side that could replace losses faster than they accumulated. And that side, despite every tactical victory that Axis forces achieved, was the United States. The Japanese Naval Command watched this. Production surged with growing alarm that curdled into disbelief. and finally settled into a kind of numbed resignation. Intelligence reports documented the Liberty ship program with precision that made the numbers undeniable. By 1943, American shipyards were producing merchant tonnage faster than German, and Japanese submarines combined could sink it. The gap was not marginal. It was overwhelming, obscene, a demonstration of industrial capacity that violated Japanese assumptions about American character and capability. The soft, democratic peoples who supposedly lacked fighting spirit were building ships with the same assembly line efficiency they had applied to automobiles, refrigerators, radios. They had transformed warfare into a manufacturing problem and solved it with techniques that Japanese industry, constrained by resources and trapped in craft traditions, could not replicate. Vice Admiral Onishi, reviewing intelligence summaries in 1943, confronted numbers that made mockery of the careful calculations that had justified war. Japan had lost approximately 40% of its merchant fleet, sunk by American submarines that operated with increasing impunity as the war progressed. Those losses were crippling to an island nation that required constant maritime supply to sustain both its civilian economy and its military operations across the Pacific. But America, which had lost thousands of merchant ships to Axis submarines, had more merchant tonnage in 1943 than it had possessed in 1941. The losses that should have strangled American logistics had been absorbed, replaced, exceeded. For every ship sunk, 2 more arrived. The tactical victories that Japanese submarines achieved, and they achieved many, sinking American vessels with skill and courage, meant nothing in the larger arithmetic of industrial war. The Liberty ship itself became a kind of taunt, a floating reminder of American abundance that Japanese forces encountered everywhere across the Pacific. They were ubiquitous, in supply convoys approaching invasion beaches, in harbors from Australia to Alaska, rusting in shallow water where they had been sunk but already replaced by identical sisters. Japanese pilots who survived attacks on American supply ships reported the same observation. Hit one and 2 more appeared. Sink a convoy, and a larger convoy arrived the following week. The American supply system seemed immune to interdiction because it was based on a principle that Japanese logistics could not match, the principle that sufficiency at massive scale defeats excellence in smaller numbers, that overwhelming material superiority can absorb tactical defeats and continue advancing through sheer replacement. Capacity, the cultural shock of confronting this reality, fractured Japanese strategic thinking. The war plan had assumed American weakness, political division, industrial inefficiency, lack of fighting spirit. But the Liberty ships demonstrated something more troubling. American strength was precisely their industrial system, their democratic culture that mobilized civilian ingenuity, their willingness to embrace unglamorous solutions at massive scale. The Japanese worshipped the warrior, the Americans worshipped the factory, and in total war, the factory proved more powerful than the sword because it could produce swords faster than warriors could break them. July 4th, 1943, Richmond Shipyard, No. 2, California. The morning sun burns through the fog that rolls off San Francisco Bay, illuminating a scene of controlled industrial chaos. Shipyard No. 2 covers acres of reclaimed mudflat, transformed in 18 months from marsh to the largest shipbuilding facility on the West Coast. Cranes tower above assemblyways where Liberty ship hulls take shape like steel skeletons gradually acquiring flesh. The sound is overwhelming, a constant assault of hammer on metal, the crack of welding torches, the shriek of cutting tools, the rumble of cranes lifting prefabricated sections into position, the shouts of foremen directing work crews, the whistle blasts marking shift changes. 24,000 workers move through this industrial landscape in orchestrated patterns, each performing specialized tasks that contribute to the collective goal: build ships faster than the enemy can sink them. Today is special. Shipyard No. 2 is launching the SS Robert E. Peary, and the launch itself is intended as propaganda demonstration, a middle finger raised to Axis submarines and a morale boost for American workers. The Peary's construction began 4 days and 15 hours ago. Now it rests on the launching way, complete from bow to stern, a functional merchant vessel ready to steam across the Pacific, carrying 10,000 tons of war material. 4 days and 15 hours. The time required to build a ship that would have taken a year using conventional methods. The Japanese shipyards could not replicate in 6 months, even if they had the resources and the workers and the steel. Henry Kaiser stands on the reviewing platform, surrounded by military brass and newsreel cameras. He is 51 years old, built like a boxer going soft, radiating the restless energy of a man who sees obstacles as puzzles to be solved through aggressive problem-solving. He has become a symbol of American can-do spirit, the self-made industrialist who revolutionized an entire industry through sheer force of will and organizational genius. The press loves him because he delivers quotable sound bites and measurable achievements. The military brass tolerates him because his shipyards are producing the tonnage that makes Pacific operations possible. The workers respect him because he pays well, promotes competence regardless of race or gender, and creates systems that allow semi-skilled labor to achieve results that previously required years of training. But Kaiser is not the main character of this story. The main character is the ship itself, the ugly, functional, entirely sufficient Liberty ship that represents American industrial philosophy made manifest in steel and welding seams. The Peary is 441 feet long, displaces 14,245 tons, cost approximately $2 million to construct. By comparison, the Japanese battleship Yamato cost approximately $250 million and required 4 years to build. The Yamato can sink 100 Liberty ships in direct combat, but America can build Liberty ships faster than the Yamato can sink them, and the Yamato can only be in one place at one time. While Liberty ships operate across every ocean simultaneously, this is the arithmetic the Japanese commanders struggle to accept. That quality does not matter if quantity is sufficiently overwhelming. That tactical superiority becomes strategically irrelevant when the opponent can absorb losses and continue advancing. Japanese submarines in the Pacific stalk American convoys with increasing desperation, knowing that even their most successful attacks, even sinking entire convoys, will be replaced within weeks by fresh ships carrying identical cargo. The psychological impact of fighting an opponent who seems immune to attrition is devastating in ways that tactical manuals do not address. Courage requires belief that sacrifice matters, that tactical victories contribute to strategic outcomes. But when tactical victories produce no strategic effect, when every success is immediately negated by enemy production, courage begins to feel like futility. The Liberty ship represents something beyond military logistics. It represents a philosophical difference in how societies organize effort and value contribution. Japanese military culture emphasized hierarchy, honor, individual excellence, achieved through discipline and sacrifice. American industrial culture emphasized systems, efficiency, collective achievement through specialization and coordination. Neither system was inherently superior. They represented different solutions to the problem of organizing human effort. But in the context of total war, requiring sustained material production across years of continuous operation, the American system possessed advantages that Japanese culture could not easily replicate. Consider the workers building the SS Robert E. Peary. They are not master craftsmen. Most have been in the shipyard for less than 6 months. Some are women, Rosie the riveters, who 6 months ago were housewives or retail clerks or school teachers. Some are African-American men excluded from skilled trades in the pre-war economy, now welding hull plates because labor shortage and patriotic necessity have temporarily overridden racial discrimination. Some are men in their 50s and 60s, too old for military service but still capable of operating cranes and cutting torches. They are not individually excellent, but they are collectively effective because Kaiser's system allows their limited skills to combine into sophisticated outputs through carefully designed processes and standardized procedures. This is industrial democracy made concrete, the idea that ordinary people, given proper tools and systems, can achieve extraordinary results. It is the same philosophy that animates American mass production generally. The assembly line logic that transformed automobiles from luxury items to middle-class necessities, that made radios and refrigerators affordable to families who a generation earlier lived without electricity. The Liberty ship is a floating expression of democratic capitalism's core assumption that human potential is broadly distributed, that systems matter more than individual genius, that abundance is achievable through organization rather than scarcity mindset. Japanese observers watching American industrial mobilization struggled to reconcile what they saw with their assumptions about American character. The intelligence reports documented facts, but could not explain the cultural foundations that made those facts possible. How does a democracy, supposedly weak, divided, lacking martial spirit, mobilize its population more effectively than a militarized authoritarian state? How do civilian workers with minimal training outproduce skilled craftsmen in traditional industries? The answers involved cultural factors that resisted easy translation: the American comfort with social mobility, the pragmatic problem-solving orientation, the absence of rigid class hierarchies that prevented talented individuals from rising based on competence, the industrial experience that had already transformed American society in ways that created baseline competencies transferable to war production. At precisely 1100 hours, the SS Robert E. Peary is christened by Rear Admiral Emery Land, who delivers a speech about American determination and industrial might. The speech is recorded by newsreel cameras for distribution to theaters across the nation, part of the continuous propaganda effort to maintain civilian morale and justify the sacrifices of rationing and war bonds and sons sent overseas. Then the champagne bottle shatters against the bow. The restraining mechanisms are released, and 14,000 tons of steel slide down the greased launching way and crash into San Francisco Bay, with a splash that sends waves radiating outward across the water. The crowd roars. The workers cheer. The newsreel cameras capture the moment for posterity. And somewhere in the Pacific, Japanese submarine commanders plan their next patrol, knowing that even their most successful mission, even sinking multiple ships in a single convoy, will not change the fundamental equation. The Americans are building ships faster than Japan can sink them. The steel tide is rising, and no amount of tactical brilliance or warrior spirit can stop an industrial process that has transformed warfare into a manufacturing problem. The SS Robert E. Peary will steam to the Pacific, will carry cargo through submarine-infested waters, will survive the war and serve in the merchant marine until scrapped in 1963. But its real significance is not its individual service record. Its significance is symbolic. It represents the moment when American industrial capacity became undeniable even to those who desperately wanted to deny it, when the mathematics of industrial war became so overwhelming that no amount of tactical excellence could compensate for strategic inferiority in productive capacity. 4 days and 15 hours to build a ship. By the time the Peary reaches the Pacific, 3 more Liberty ships will have been launched from Richmond shipyards alone. By the time it completes its first cargo run, another dozen will have joined the merchant fleet. That the multiplication is relentless, inexorable, immune to interdiction, because it is based not on limited resources or scarce expertise, but on standardized processes that can be replicated indefinitely, as long as steel and welding rods and workers are available. And America in 1943 has all three in quantities that make Japanese resource constraints look like poverty by comparison. The Japanese submarine campaign in the Pacific began with tactical sophistication that reflected years of training and doctrinal development. Japanese submariners were among the best in the world, skilled, disciplined, operating advanced submarines equipped with the Type 95 torpedo, arguably the most effective torpedo of the war. In the first months after Pearl Harbor, Japanese submarines achieved significant successes, sinking Allied vessels and disrupting supply lines with coordinated attacks that demonstrated professional competence and tactical acumen. But even these early successes contained the seeds of strategic irrelevance because Japanese submarine doctrine emphasized attacking warships rather than merchant vessels. The strategic goal was to weaken enemy naval forces, to achieve the decisive fleet battle that Japanese naval doctrine had always envisioned as the war's climactic moment. American submarines, by contrast, adopted unrestricted warfare against Japanese merchant shipping from the war's beginning. They targeted tankers, freighters, cargo vessels, the unglamorous logistics ships that kept Japan's island empire supplied with oil from the East Indies, rice from Indochina, iron ore from Manchuria. It was ungentlemanly, violations of pre-war naval conventions that restricted submarine warfare. It was also devastatingly effective because it attacked Japan's fundamental strategic vulnerability. The empire was a maritime logistics network spread across thousands of miles of ocean, entirely dependent on merchant shipping to function. Sink enough tankers, and Japanese aircraft sat idle for lack of aviation fuel. Sink enough freighters, and Japanese factories closed for lack of raw materials. Sink enough cargo ships, and Japanese soldiers in remote garrisons starved or ran out of ammunition. By mid-1943, the asymmetry became apparent to anyone willing to examine the statistics honestly. American submarines were decimating Japanese merchant shipping, sinking vessels faster than Japanese shipyards could replace them. Japanese submarines were sinking American merchant ships at rates that would have been strategically significant in any previous war. But against American shipbuilding capacity, their successes were immediately negated by replacement vessels that appeared with assembly line regularity. The Japanese submarine force, skilled, brave, tactically proficient, found itself in the nightmare scenario of fighting an opponent who seemed immune to attrition because losses were replaced faster than they accumulated. The psychological impact on Japanese submarine crews was profound and demoralizing. They were winning individual battles and losing the strategic war. Lieutenant Commander Toshio Hashimoto, who survived the war and wrote memoirs documenting his submarine service, described the growing sense of futility. We would sink a convoy ship, celebrate the success, return to port for resupply, and intelligence reports would show that American merchant fleet tonnage had increased during our patrol. It was like trying to bail water from a boat while someone poured more water in faster than we could bail. The arithmetic made victory impossible, but we were forbidden to speak of this reality. Forbidden is the key word. Japanese military culture did not permit honest assessment of losing strategic situations. To suggest that American industrial capacity made victory impossible was defeatist, unpatriotic, a betrayal of the warrior spirit that supposedly could overcome any material disadvantage through discipline and sacrifice. Officers who raised concerns about the unsustainable loss ratios were reassigned or reprimanded. The official line remained optimistic. Japanese forces were inflicting heavy losses on American shipping. The American people would eventually tire of war. Negotiated peace remained achievable if Japan could hold its defensive perimeter and make American advance sufficiently costly, but the Liberty ships made this strategic fiction increasingly difficult to maintain. They were everywhere, in every American convoy, in every harbor, rusting on every beach where amphibious assaults had succeeded. Japanese pilots who attacked American supply convoys reported the same bewildering observation. The ships all looked identical, as if America was producing them from a template, replacing losses with interchangeable units like spare parts rather than unique vessels. This was precisely what America was doing, but the concept violated Japanese understanding of how shipbuilding worked. Ships were supposed to be individual creations, each built by skilled craftsmen, each slightly unique. The industrial logic of mass production, of treating complex vessels as assembled components, represented a cognitive challenge to Japanese military culture's assumptions about the relationship between quality and quantity. Vice Admiral Onishi, reviewing intelligence summaries in late 1943, confronted data that demolished every assumption that had justified the war. American merchant fleet tonnage in 1943 exceeded 1941 levels by over 20%, despite 2 years of sustained Axis submarine attacks. Liberty ship production was accelerating, not declining. American shipyards had achieved the economy of scale, where increased production actually reduced per-unit costs. The steel tide was not a temporary surge, but a sustained industrial mobilization that would continue for as long as the war lasted, producing ships faster than submarines could sink them, creating an invulnerable logistics network that made American advance across the Pacific mathematically inevitable regardless of Japanese tactical victories. The realization produced a kind of strategic despair that Onishi could not express openly, but documented in private journals that survived the war. "We are fighting an enemy that treats war as manufacturing," he wrote. "Our warriors face their factories. Our spirit confronts their steel. We win battles and lose tonnage ratios. We sacrifice courageously, and they replace losses mechanically. How does one defeat an opponent who measures victory not in honor, but in production rates?" The question had no answer within Japanese strategic framework. The warrior culture that had animated Japanese military success could not adapt to industrial warfare, where tactical excellence became strategically irrelevant in the face of overwhelming material superiority. Japanese submariners continued fighting with skill and courage, continued sinking American ships, continued dying in submarines that were hunted with increasing effectiveness by American anti-submarine warfare that combined air patrols, destroyer escorts, and signals intelligence that betrayed Japanese submarine positions. They fought bravely. They achieved tactical successes, and they had no meaningful impact on the strategic outcome because American shipyards produced vessels faster than Japanese submarines could sink them. By 1944, the Liberty ship had evolved from controversial innovation to proven war winner. The United States Maritime Commission had authorized construction of 2,710 Liberty ships. By war's end, 2,710 would be delivered. Every single vessel authorized, built, delivered to the merchant marine or the military for war service. The production represented the largest shipbuilding program in human history, a demonstration of industrial capacity that transformed global power relationships and confirmed American emergence as the world's dominant economic power. The ships carried the material that sustained Allied offensives across 2 oceans, the food and ammunition and fuel and trucks and tanks and aircraft that made American military operations possible despite Japanese and German resistance. The Liberty ship also represented a philosophical victory more profound than any battlefield triumph. It demonstrated that democratic industrial capitalism, messy, inefficient, apparently weak compared to disciplined authoritarian systems, could mobilize human potential at scales that authoritarian states could not match. The workers building Liberty ships were not martial heroes. They were ordinary civilians trained in specialized tasks, working for wages in shipyards that prioritized safety and efficiency over martial glory. They represented everything that Japanese and German military cultures despised about democracy: its comfortable mediocrity, its lack of martial spirit, its prioritization of individual welfare over collective sacrifice. But these ordinary workers, organized through industrial systems that valued competence over aristocratic breeding, produced the material foundation for Allied victory. They outproduced authoritarian states that had spent decades preparing for total war. They built ships faster than military planners thought possible, using techniques that traditional craftsmen said would fail, operated by crews who learned their skills in weeks rather than years. They transformed warfare into a problem of industrial production and solved it with assembly line efficiency that made tactical brilliance increasingly irrelevant. The Japanese commanders who had been stunned by American shipbuilding capacity became resigned to it by 1944, accepted it as an unchangeable fact like weather or geography. Intelligence officers stopped even trying to track individual Liberty ships because they were too numerous, too interchangeable, too insignificant as individual vessels. What mattered was not any single ship but the fleet, the vast armada of merchant vessels that sustained American advance across the Pacific despite Japanese resistance. Despite tactical defeats, despite the enormous distances and logistical challenges that should have made Pacific campaign impossible for any nation less industrially capable than the United States, the sound of liberty, ships being launched, that daily crash of hulls hitting water in American shipyards, became the soundtrack of Japanese strategic defeat. It was a sound that Japanese commanders heard in their nightmares, a constant reminder that they were losing a war of attrition against an opponent who had transformed attrition into an industrial process. Every day another ship, every week another convoy, every month another amphibious assault supported by logistics that Japanese forces could disrupt but never sever because the supply lines were too redundant, too well defended, too constantly replenished to be interdicted effectively. The warrior faces the factory. The factory wins, not through superior courage or tactical brilliance, but through the patient, inexorable accumulation of material advantage that makes courage and brilliance ultimately futile. This was the lesson that Liberty ships taught to Japanese military culture, a lesson so devastating that it could not be fully acknowledged until after surrender, when Japanese officers reviewing the war's outcome could finally speak honestly about the mathematical impossibility of victory against an industrial power that had mobilized civilian production at scales that military preparation could not match. August 15, 1945, Kure Naval Arsenal, Hiroshima Prefecture, Japan. The same dockyard where Vice Admiral Onishi stood in December 1941 is now a landscape of destruction. American bombers have methodically dismantled Japan's industrial capacity, and the Kure arsenal has been a priority target. The battleship Yamato, the symbol of Japanese naval supremacy, lies at the bottom of the East China Sea, sunk by American carrier aircraft during a suicide mission to Okinawa. The ship that took 4 years to build survived less than 2 years of war service before being overwhelmed by air power that Japanese designers had not adequately anticipated. Onishi himself is dead, killed by his own hand on August 16th, leaving a suicide note that apologized to the spirits of fallen warriors and expressed hope that younger generations would rebuild Japan without repeating the mistakes of military ideology. His death was symbolic, a recognition that the warrior culture had led Japan to catastrophic defeat against an opponent who fought with factories rather than samurai. Spirit, the dockyards are silent except for the sounds of surrender, the shuffling of workers too exhausted to process the reality of defeat, the occasional weeping of men who have lost sons or brothers or husbands to a war that consumed an entire generation. Around them, the physical evidence of Japan's industrial inadequacy is overwhelming. The arsenals are bombed-out shells. The merchant fleet is 90% destroyed. The cities are ash and rubble. The empire has contracted from its maximum extent, controlling territory from Burma to the Central Pacific, to the home islands themselves, occupied by American forces who arrived on Liberty ships that survived kamikaze attacks and submarine ambushes to deliver the material that made invasion possible. In a warehouse that somehow escaped the bombing, a Japanese naval intelligence officer named Commander Yoshio Takahashi sits among files and reports that document the war's progression. He has been tasked with compiling lessons learned analysis for the new Japanese government, a humiliating assignment that requires honest assessment of why Japan lost. The files contain intelligence reports from 1941 onward, documenting American shipbuilding with precision that makes the outcome seem inevitable in retrospect. The Liberty ship program, the production acceleration, the replacement rates that exceeded sinking rates, the arithmetic of industrial war laid out in graphs and statistics that could not be dismissed as American propaganda because Japanese submarines had witnessed the reality firsthand. Takahashi writes in his report, "We understood American industrial capacity in abstract terms, as statistics and production figures. What we failed to understand was the cultural foundation that made such production possible. American workers were not forced laborers or conscripts. They were paid wages, worked in safe conditions, received health care and childcare, and benefits that Japanese industry would consider wasteful inefficiency. Yet they outproduced Japanese workers by factors of 5, 10, 20 in specific industries. This suggests that our assumptions about the superiority of discipline over freedom, of martial spirit over material comfort, were fundamentally mistaken. The Americans defeated us not despite their democracy, but because of it, because their system mobilized human potential in ways that our authoritarian structure could not replicate. This conclusion is heretical to everything Japanese military culture had believed about the relationship between discipline and productivity, about the superiority of warrior spirit over merchant mentality. But it is also undeniable when confronted with the evidence. The Liberty ships did not appear through martial discipline or warrior sacrifice. They appeared through industrial organization, through systems that allowed ordinary workers to achieve extraordinary production, through cultural values that prioritized practical results over ideological purity. The Liberty ship itself, ugly, functional, entirely sufficient, became the symbol of American victory in ways that no weapon system could match. It was not the atomic bomb that defeated Japan, though the bomb provided the final psychological shock that made surrender acceptable. It was not American submarines, though they destroyed Japanese merchant fleet with devastating effectiveness. It was not the island-hopping campaign, though American forces demonstrated tactical competence and courage in battles from Guadalcanal to Okinawa. What defeated Japan was the industrial capacity that sustained all of these efforts simultaneously. The ability to build ships and aircraft and tanks and guns faster than Japan could destroy them, to replace losses with assembly line regularity, to treat war as a manufacturing problem that could be solved through sufficient application of resources and organization. The 710 Liberty ships, authorized and built during the war, represented a production total that exceeded Japanese wildest predictions. They carried 18 million tons of cargo in military service. They sustained Allied forces across 2 oceans. They survived or were replaced when lost. The individual vessels mattered less than the fleet's collective capacity, the redundancy that made American logistics immune to interdiction. They were crewed by civilian merchant marines who faced death from submarines and aircraft and kamikaze attacks, but kept sailing because the wages were good and the work mattered, and American culture valorized practical contribution as much as martial heroism. In the decades following the war, historians would debate whether Japan could have won under any circumstances, whether different strategy or better tactics or earlier surrender could have produced better outcomes. The Liberty ship provides the answer to these counterfactuals. Japan could not have won because winning required matching American industrial production. And matching American production required industrial capacity that Japan did not possess and cultural foundations that Japanese society had not developed. The warrior could not defeat the factory because the factory could produce warriors faster than warriors could destroy. Factories could build the ships and planes and tanks that gave ordinary soldiers the material superiority that compensated for any advantage in individual skill or courage. The sound of liberty, ships being launched, that daily celebration. In American shipyards during the war years was the sound of victory being manufactured one hull at a time. It was a sound that Japanese commanders learned to dread, a constant reminder that they were fighting an unwinnable war against an opponent who had mastered the industrial age in ways that military culture could not match. The ships were ugly. They were crude. They violated every principle of elegant engineering that Japanese craftsmen valued. But they floated, they carried cargo, they were produced faster than submarines could sink them, and in their unglamorous sufficiency, they embodied the American genius for solving problems through overwhelming material application rather than elegant minimalism, Commander. Takahashi completes his report and files it with the occupation authorities. The document will be buried in archives, dismissed as defeatist thinking by Japanese nationalists who prefer to remember the war as a noble sacrifice rather than strategic miscalculation. But the conclusion remains valid. Japan lost because it fought an industrial war with a warrior culture, because it assumed that spirit could overcome material disadvantage, because it faced an opponent who had transformed warfare into manufacturing and won through production rates rather than tactical brilliance. The Liberty ships sailed on through the post-war years, some serving in the merchant marine until the 1960s, some sold to other nations, some scrapped for steel that would build the peaceful industrial economy that replaced Japanese militarism. They were never beautiful. They were never elegant. But they were sufficient, and in total war, sufficiency at scale defeats excellence in scarcity. This is the lesson that Liberty ships taught, a lesson about industrial capacity and democratic mobilization and the power of ordinary workers organized through effective systems to achieve extraordinary results. The sound that Vice Admiral Onishi could not hear in December 1941, the sound of American shipyards, launching vessels faster than submarines. It could sink them, became the defining sound of the Pacific War. It drowned out the prayers at Shinto shrines and the battle, cries of banzai charges and the desperate courage of warriors fighting against mathematics that made victory impossible. It was the sound of democracy outproducing autocracy, of factories defeating warriors, of American abundance overwhelming Japanese scarcity through sheer patient accumulation of material advantage. The steel tide rose. It carried supplies to remote atolls and invasion beaches. It sustained armies across oceanic distances that made logistics as important as tactics. It proved immune to interdiction because individual vessels mattered less than collective capacity, because losing one ship meant nothing when 3 more were launching the same day. The tide kept rising until it drowned Japanese resistance beneath an ocean of welded hull plates and diesel engines and cargo holds filled with American production. The Liberty ships were not elegant weapons. They were industrial instruments, tools designed for a specific purpose and optimized for mass production rather than individual excellence. They won not through superiority, but through sufficiency. Sufficiency multiplied by industrial capacity until quantity became its own form of quality, until abundance itself became a weapon that no amount of tactical skill could defeat. This is the truth that Liberty ships represent, that free peoples, mobilized through democratic institutions and organized through industrial systems, can achieve material supremacy that makes autocratic efficiency irrelevant. The Japanese commanders were stunned because their cultural framework could not accommodate this reality, could not accept that the soft democratic Americans would outproduce, out-organize and out-fight an authoritarian state that had spent decades preparing for total war. The Liberty ships proved them wrong, one hull at a time, until the arithmetic of defeat became undeniable even to those most invested in denial. The ships have mostly vanished now, scrapped or sunk or converted to other purposes. But the lesson remains, carved into history like words on a memorial. Abundance defeats scarcity. Industrial democracy defeats martial autocracy. And ordinary workers organized through effective systems can change the world more profoundly than elite warriors sacrificing for ideological abstractions. The Liberty ships floated and fought and carried the material that made victory possible. They were ugly and crude and entirely sufficient, and in their sufficiency, multiplied across 2,110 identical hulls built faster than enemies could comprehend. They embodied the American answer to total war, not through superior courage or tactical brilliance, but through the patient, inexorable application of industrial capacity that transformed conflict into a manufacturing problem and solved it with assembly line precision that made heroism almost irrelevant. The steel tide rose. It covered the Pacific. It could not be stopped or negotiated with or defeated through sacrifice. It simply continued, relentless as industrial process, until resistance became mathematically futile and surrender became the only rational choice for an opponent who had learned, too late, that modern war is won not by warriors alone, but by shipyards and factories and the unglamorous work of ordinary people building ships faster than submarines can sink them.